For the United States, the World War II is the second costliest war in American history. Only the Civil War actually exceeds the numbers killed. However, it is the costliest war in terms of expense, in terms of money. Now, when it comes to American war dead, here's how it breaks down. 293,000 men were killed in battle, and a further 116,000 died from other causes, diseases, or accidents. About 670,000 men were wounded in combat. Financial expenditures for the United States basically is going to be estimated at $315 billion. That's about 10 times the amount dispersed in all of its previous wars combined. Now, warfare on the scale of World War II required the total participation of the nation. The United States needed to mobilize national resources quickly, manufacturing facilities, food, labor, transportation. By the middle of 1943, the American people had converted their peacetime industrial establishment into the mightiest wartime arsenal the world had ever seen. The government, following the same pattern of FDR's New Deal's administrative state, created agencies to handle the necessary production of war goods. The 9-member War Production Board supervised the construction of new plants and the manufacture of war commodities, and switched many existing plants from peacetime to wartime footings. Within a year after Pearl Harbor, the nation was producing more than $47 billion worth of war material, including 32,000 tanks, 49,000 aircraft, and merchant ships totaling 8 million tons. By the end of the war, the nation had produced, under this War Production Board, 85,000 tanks, almost 300,000 airplanes, 70,000 warships, and 5,500 merchant ships. Although the manufacture of many peacetime commodities was either curtailed or prohibited in order to facilitate the manufacture of war items, the total industrial production of the nation doubled during the war. Despite excellent harvests during World War II, it was difficult to meet the extraordinary demand for foodstuffs. Food production and distribution was supervised by the Food Administration. In addition to providing food for U.S. troops, the nation sent about $7 billion worth of food to Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Domestic consumption was primarily controlled through the rationing imposed by the Office of Price Administration, the OPA. Such food like sugar, coffee, meat, and butter were rationed to the civilian population. The OPA also fixed prices and rationed commodities like tires and gasoline. Although the activities of workers were more strictly supervised by the government than any other time in U.S. history, American laborers escaped the kind of regimentation experienced by workers of most countries during that war. Particularly organized labor, generally refrained from strikes during the first years of the war. American output between 1942 and 1945 surpassed any previous record for a comparable period of time. At the same time, average weekly earnings rose from $25 to about $45, while the length of the work week increased from approximately 38 to about 45 hours. The National War Labor Board was established to settle management labor disputes through mediation and arbitration. When labor strife flares up in 1943, Congress passes, over Roosevelt's veto, the War Labor Disputes Act. The Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act is another word for it, which, amongst other things, authorized the President of the United States to seize plants where labor disturbances threatened to impede war production. Between January of 1940 and January of 1943, the appropriations, first for national defense and then for war, amounted to about $220 billion, slightly more than the cost of the government for the inauguration between the inauguration of George Washington in 1789 and 1940. During World War II, the national debt rose from $47 billion to $247 billion. By the second year of the war, it is estimated that the daily cost of the conflict was about $1.15 for every man, woman, and child, while the revenue from taxes was scarcely 40 cents per person. Successive tax bills were designed and passed to pay for the war through taxation as opposed to borrowing. This was accomplished through many means. For example, adding millions of taxpayers to the rolls, while through lowering the minimum tax-exempt income. Revising upward the personal income tax rates, imposing on corporations a virtual confiscation of income that represented excess profits from the war. And in 1943, Congress would put into place a plan to collect personal income taxes as withholding, pay-as-you-go basis. Despite increased revenue from taxes, the federal government borrowed from the sale of war bonds to meet the bulk of war costs. By July of 1945, the government had conducted 7 highly successful war bond drives, which approximately brought in $61 billion. Now, the election of 1944 was the first presidential election to take place during wartime since 1864. Roosevelt was going to be nominated for a 4th term on the first ballot. The party's decision to choose a less liberal vice president caused the choice of Senator Harry Truman to become Roosevelt's running mate. The delegates at the Republican National Convention yielded to the apparent popularity of the mildly liberal internationalist governor Thomas Dewey of New York, and they nominated him with just 1 dissenting vote. Roosevelt and Dewey held quite similar views on both domestic and war issues. Dewey's campaign speeches argued that it was time for the voters to retire the tired old men from the FDR administration. Only as the campaign entered the latter stage did Roosevelt actually become involved in terms of giving some tough speeches in his familiar dynamic style. Out of almost 48 million votes cast, Roosevelt received about 2.3 million more votes than Dewey. In the Electoral College, he carried 36 states, with 432 votes, with 99 votes going to Dewey. The regard for Roosevelt had held strong throughout his entire terms.